Oh, there's Senator McCormick. Good afternoon again, everybody. Welcome back to Senate Institutions. We are still on April the 9th, and we are delving into a conversation about ARPA funds. I've asked Julie Moore, the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, to come and join us this afternoon. I believe she's going to be joined by Emily Byrne, who's the Director of Finance and Administration of the same agency. But Julie, I'm not sure you've been in front of us this year.
I don't believe I have.
Hi, Julie.
Okay, and Emily, this message is for you as well. We try to understand that there is an audience out there on YouTube that may be people who have never experienced this process before, haven't any idea who any of us are. And so we flip on this switch and go live to the world at large. And suddenly there are people out there who have just no idea what's going on here, but we try to educate them. So if in presenting yourselves this afternoon, you could start with a 50,000-foot view level of who you are, how you came to be in state government, and how you fit into the discussion surrounding the Capitol bill. Now, I realize some of the conversation is dealing with money that may not be coming through the Capitol bill, but since none of the guidelines have been really fleshed out yet and no decisions have been made, I'm going to consider the possibility that some might come through the Capitol bill during the time, especially of Capitol bill adjustment next year. So we're looking at a basic introductory education. Julie, I heard you giving a presentation the other day on the ARPA funds as you're one of the 5 buckets that the governor was referring to. And I'm hoping to get that same conversation replicated here for the benefit of the committee and whoever may be watching us in the world at large. So welcome to Institutions, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources. The Agency of Natural Resources is actually comprised of 3 departments. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, and the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is largely responsible for the state's environmental permitting programs. All told, we have a staff of about 600. We swelled to nearly 1,000 employees during the summer when we are operating Vermont's 65 state park, or 55, excuse me, staffed state parks. And I believe I have the best job in state government. So,
well, let me freeze you right there. Does that mean that Snyder and Porter are both working for you?
That is correct.
We're going to have to remember that, committee, as we go through the conversations. We will use that.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, and Emily Byrne is the agency's chief financial officer. So within the agency itself, we're a fairly small staff, under 30 people, but we have a business office. We have some administrative support functions, and then some legal services that sit within the agency. All of the rest of ANR staff are distributed across the 3 departments. And so I can speak to the ARPA funding and the governor's proposals. There are actually 2 buckets that are very germane to the work of the Agency of Natural Resources: climate and water infrastructure. I can provide a high-level overview of all of them. Some of this will feel like old hat to Senator McCormick, since I gave a similar overview in Senate Natural Resources this morning. But happy to have you interrupt me as we go along and ask questions. Do I have the ability to share my screen, Denise?
Someday I want to hook up an EKG machine to Denise's body and watch how the machine goes up when she gets into this position. She can yell.
Well, she handled it deftly, because here we go.
There you go.
So as you may have heard from the governor's announcements earlier this week, he's proposed, I would say, 5 large buckets that the $1 billion in somewhat discretionary state money would flow into. This is part of a larger $2.7 billion allocation that the state of Vermont is slated to receive as part of the American Rescue Plan Fund. But a lot of those the remaining $1.6 billion has fairly narrow purposes, whether it's education, That's probably the biggest one, healthcare stabilization. Those are sort of outside of the proposals shown here. So the governor identified 5 high priority initiatives: economic development, and this is both funding for capital projects important to that have been identified by regional development commissions and regional planning commissions, as well as some additional business stabilization grants. The climate change and water and sewer buckets that I'll talk about in more detail. A $249 million housing initiative that would result in the construction of 5,000 units of additional housing statewide, including providing housing for the homeless population that is currently part of the hotel motel program. And then a $250 million commitment to improving broadband connectivity and reaching those last mile homes. In addition, there's about $17 million identified to need to support the administration of these programs through business offices and the Attorney General's office in particular in reviewing contracts. I can then step into a bit more detail in the 2 buckets that are sort of within my wheelhouse, the first one being climate change. The overall or the overarching theme to the $200 million worth of investments we're proposing is technology, infrastructure, and hazard reduction. And this has the benefits of reducing greenhouse gases, improving air quality, and in particular, indoor air quality, which yields real benefits for public health, and also enhancing Vermont's landscape level resilience. Those top 4 elements of the $200 million proposal are what I would consider no regrets policies. And then there's $100 million of this investment that's proposed to be held in reserve to support initial implementation of the Climate Action Plan. And as you may recall, the Vermont Climate Council is busy at work, and we are on track to deliver the draft of the climate action, or adopt a climate action plan, excuse me, I should say, by December 1st of this year. And so that $100 million would support implementation of the initial recommendations coming out of it. It's not to say that some of those recommendations may not tack and tie very closely to the first 4 lines indicated in the governor's climate investment proposals, because these really are foundational. But this is work we felt like could get underway right now, and it would very much align with what we anticipate to come out of the Climate Action Plan. So the first of those no regrets investments is $25 million in electric vehicle infrastructure. This is envisioned to be both type 2 and type 3 charging systems, or stage 2 and stage 3 charging systems. These systems would be placed at state facilities and along state highways, as well as at businesses, multifamily housing locations, and other activity centers. This would add to the 292 currently publicly available charging infrastructure stations. And we know that having this electric vehicle charging infrastructure is essential to the adoption of electric vehicles.
Can I ask you a question as you're on that subject? The current charging stations, are they free of charge, or do you have to pay a sum of money?
It depends. Most of them require either an account or they are like a pay-go system where you would pay just based on a single charge.
And where does that
there
money
are
go?
some that are free, but those are largely ones that are have been installed by businesses to the benefit of their employees.
Where does the money go for that?
So in the case of something like a charge point system, which is a vendor, it would go to the vendor and presumably cover their costs associated with the electricity itself, as well as the infrastructure investment they've made to provide the site.
Do any of our current charging stations have vendors associated with them?
They do. So there are networks of charging stations. ChargePoint, I believe, is the one that the state works with. I think that is the charging stations that are down at the bottom of, is it Governor Aiken Way next to 133 State Street. There's also ChargePoint stations up in the National Life parking garage, as well as over on Green Mountain Drive in Montpelier, where the fleet cars are housed. And so while we can charge state vehicles at those stations when we're on site, There's also charge point stations sort of located throughout the state. Prior to COVID, there was one at UVM, for example, that I would use frequently when I would make the trip to Burlington, plug in at UVM while I was at my meeting so the car could recharge and I could drive back.
So at the 50,000 foot level, the reason I'm asking these questions, most of the population has not transferred to a fleet of electric vehicles. And learning for the first time how the system works, I was very curious because I've seen the charging stations and wondered who's monitoring them, who's getting the benefit from them. Is there a point in time where the money that is going through those charging systems will be made to support our roads and bridges?
There is a PUC docket to that effect right now, asking those questions, because that is, as the number of electric vehicles on the road grows, it's going to have an impact on state highway funding. I'm sure Senator Mazza could probably talk about that in a lot more detail.
That's our goal right now, is we want to have a piece of that, the equivalent of a gallon of gasoline that would go to the infrastructure. And I think, everyone's looking at this as the population grows. There's only 3,800 electric vehicles now in Vermont registered out of 600,000, but we're losing that revenue when they plug into and what they would do is like a certain amount of kilowatt money would come to us out of that charging station. That's what we're looking into. Yeah.
We're glad you're on top of it, Dick.
Well, no, that's a big concern of mine because it is our right to provide electricity. We want to promote it, but on the other hand, how are we going to pay for our infrastructure if they're taking our gasoline tax?
Yeah, no, I'm serious. I'm glad that you're on top of it because that's a major transformation that we're going to be undergoing as the years go on. And
yeah, you're right. Yeah.
good
Chairman?
conversation. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this. I'm not disputing Senator Mazza. I agree that it is, as more and more cars go electric, the state loses the revenues from the gas tax, and that is a problem. And people who drive on our roads really need to pay their way. Having said that, there's also, and Senator Mazza alluded to it, I just want to bring that up again. There is the matter of, we do want to encourage the move from gasoline to electricity.
Did you see
And right now there's an incentive. It's a dilemma.
The incentives right now, you can buy almost a $40,000 hybrid or gas electric car for less than $25,000. That's how many incentives are out there between the manufacturer, the state of Vermont, federal government. The incentives are fantastic. Yeah.
No, point well taken, Senator. I'm not disputing you.
I understand.
I wanted to put in a word for the idea that we do want to incentivize, and that's all.
Yeah,
And it is a dilemma. No, because I hear from constituents who think the loss of revenue is really the only issue.
No,
I just want
no, it isn't. No.
Okay.
I just, I'll pause, Julie, to say this is common on our committee. It's a lot of fun to listen to the debate go back and forth. From the 50,000 foot view level again, the news is full of reports that various manufacturers are turning to electric vehicles by a given date. So it is a conversation that is certainly on our doorstep that we need to flesh out, and taking this brief opportunity to just explain to the public that we're actually thinking about these very same questions that people are asking themselves as they drive by something they're unfamiliar with. It's good to know everybody's chatting in the same direction.
And GM says no gas-powered vehicles by 2035. I mean, that's not far away.
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
So,
and we know from the initial work of the Climate Council that 40% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the transportation sector. So we need to make some fairly significant changes within that sector to achieve the goals or the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And fully anticipate that the Climate Action Plan will contain a suite of recommendations in this space, but continuing to build out the infrastructure is going to be an essential component, and so seemed like something it made sense to get out in front of while the work of the Climate Council continues.
So you brought up the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is a bill that we passed a year or two ago now, but it changed what were goals into mandates.
Correct.
In your opinion, if the transportation fleet is transformed, do you think we will make those mandates?
That alone will not be sufficient, but it is an integral component. We can't meet the mandates without addressing transportation, but there will be other components to that work. Probably most notably needs to address building energy use, so heating and cooling within our homes, but also our workplaces and commercial establishments in order to meet that goal. Taken together, building, heating and cooling, and transportation are nearly 2/3 of our total greenhouse gas emissions here in Vermont.
Okay, so as the industry in transportation takes the discussion literally out of our hands because they're all moving in the direction of electric vehicles, we still have the other sectors that we're going to have to address moving forward.
Correct. And it's not part of the math and the modeling we are doing through the Climate Council is looking at the timelines that industry has proposed and the timelines that are necessary to meet the mandates contained in the act. And it's not entirely clear to me yet that we don't actually have to go faster.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks. Good
You're
interruption.
welcome. No problem. The next element of those no regrets policies is a continued investment in weatherization. As you may recall, in the governor's FY22 budget, he recommended monies for weatherization, both into the Office of Economic Opportunity within AHS for low-income weatherization, as well as creating a capital fund program through the Vermont Housing Finance Administration or agency that would address middle-income Vermonters. This $21 million is intended to sort of put all the way to the edge of the full capacity work being done by OEO through the end of 2024. So this is in addition to and builds upon the recommendation in the governor's FY22 budget.
OEO stands for?
Office of Economic Opportunity.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it's part of the Department of Children and Families at the Agency of Human Services. The next bucket of money or tranche of money is $29 million for electrification incentives. This is looking at both load management within our grid, as well as opportunities for what might be termed beneficial electrification, and includes some elements of storage as well. So as I'm sure you're all aware, renewable energy sources aren't what we consider base load, where they generate a consistent amount of power across a day, over weeks, and throughout the year. Instead, there tends to be seasonal variability, whether it's solar panels or wind. And yet most of our energy demands tend to be a little bit more stable over time. And so these electrification incentives are looking at ways to take full advantage of the renewables we already have online and make sure they're as useful as possible to Vermonters in drawing down that clean renewable energy. Beneficial electrification is prioritizing things like all electric heating systems in places in the state where we have excess generation capacity. Storage is meant to buffer against those peaks and valleys. And then load management work is looking at our electrical grid as a whole and trying to make sure that there are ways to move those electrons around to ensure they're where they need to be when they need to be there.
Most people don't really understand this concept, but when you generate electricity in a given location and it's going to be used somewhere else, it has to get from point A to point B. And that, at the moment, as I understand it, is quite limited in how much expansion we can do right now. As my time on the Natural Resources Committee, I remember.
Correct.
So is part of this 29 million to address that situation?
It is. So that there's a particular area called the SHIA, which is Sheldon Highgate something interface area, I think. But that's the area of Vermont's grid system. So up in Franklin County, where there's a significant amount of renewable generation sources that have been brought online. And during peak generation, so on a bright sunny day like today, it can be challenging to actually get all of that energy into the grid and distributed. And so a lot of work, or there's interest in doing work in that space to make sure Not only have we brought renewable energy sources online, but we're able to take full advantage of them, which my understanding is at times right now we're not.
Yep. Okay.
And then the last piece of these no regrets investments is hazard mitigation buyout. And this is actually $25 million to support some of the highest priority recommendations contained in the 2018 Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan. Specifically, the hazard mitigation plan had identified that there are a number of locations within Vermont that are routinely impacted by flooding, that are unable to access FEMA buyout dollars, and that there would be enormous value in creating a state level buyout program. And so that's what this money would go to fund. And it's actually a pretty, I think, exciting opportunity to help improve resilience within Vermont. Some of the most challenging and frankly heartbreaking situations are dealing with homeowners whose homes have repeatedly been damaged by flood events. Obviously, they wouldn't have a good opportunity to resell their homes on the real estate market, and yet are financially tied to them absent the ability to sell. And so our hope would be to create a program that would allow them to move out of harm's way. And then, as I indicated in my opening remarks, the remaining $100 million is proposed to be held in reserve until the climate action plan is adopted by the Vermont Climate Council in December.
Okay.
The second bucket is of water infrastructure money, and there's $170 million proposed there. As you may have read, the American Rescue Plan narrative specifically names water and sewer infrastructure as being an allowable use of these funds. And so this aligns, I think, very well with the Treasury guidance we're all waiting on. And we've actually proposed 5 different categories of investment. The first is relative to stormwater retrofit projects. The bulk of these resources would be dedicated to helping support implementation of the so-called 3-acre stormwater permit. This is a retrofit permit that's required for any parcels that have more than 3 acres of impervious surface and don't currently have a modern stormwater permit. There are about 700 of these parcels spread throughout the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins that are being asked currently to design and will ultimately need to implement a stormwater retrofit. And there is funding contained in this line to support the permitting and engineering for those sites, as well as to help accelerate implementation for landowners who may be ready to go. There's a 10-year timeframe overall provided for sites to complete the design and installation of these 3-acre retrofit projects. But our hope is by being able to offer incentives in terms of cost share and grants that will be able to accelerate adoption. And those 3-acre stormwater retrofits are important to our abilities to meet our overall water quality goals for both Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. The next line item, village water, wastewater, and pretreatment, is looking at sort of our unsewered village centers and downtowns. There are more than 150 of these compact areas of settlement statewide that don't have a community scale system. This doesn't necessarily mean it takes the form of a traditional treatment plant and sort of town edge to town edge sewer system. Oftentimes, these community or village scale water and wastewater systems are soil-based disposal, but they are nonetheless essential for the ability to redevelop and infill within these areas where we want growth to occur. One of my favorite examples is the Brownsville General Store, which is down by Mount Ascutney. This was an aging general store, and a young couple purchased it and wanted to create a dine-in cafe component of the Brownsville market. They were unable to do that initially because there was no, their existing wastewater system lacked any capacity beyond what it had already been permitted for, and a cafe requires an additional allowance. By pursuing a community-based system solution, it addressed the needs of not only the general store, but also the nearby fire department and a couple other residences that also were wastewater limited. And so these types of solutions allow oftentimes for the addition of an in-law suite or accessory dwelling unit. This type of conversion I'm talking about, where you take an existing storefront and are able to turn it into a restaurant or a cafe. And those oftentimes that kind of core economic development is just unavailable absent wastewater capacity. We have an initiative where we've been working with a handful of communities to try to help them through this planning process, which it can be complex, but have been rather stymied by the lack of money to support implementation of these types of projects. So this is a very exciting proposal from a number of perspectives. Another community that in some ways is probably the poster child for this investment is Montgomery. They had gone through the Vermont Council on Rural Development's community planning process and had identified a number of different types of economic activities they wanted to pursue for their village center, and realized none of them could go forward absent trying to come to a solution for wastewater treatment capacity. So we know that the need is out there, and think that these also offer really incredible economic growth opportunities for some of these village centers. In addition, pre-treatment is part of this category, and pre-treatment is something that generally ties with generators of high strength waste. And when I say high strength waste, I mean things like breweries, distilleries, meat or dairy processing facilities, things that are making a very rich waste that oftentimes is challenging for a small wastewater treatment facility to handle. We know that the lack of pre-treatment is oftentimes a limitation on the ability of these facilities to grow. And so looking at the opportunity to provide grants and cost share to help community or help businesses invest in pre-treatment to allow them to grow in place, rather than to have to relocate to one of Vermont's larger communities with a wastewater plant that would be better able to absorb their high strength load. The third category of funding is CSO abatement. CSOs are combined sewer overflows, and sewer overflows have been in the news a lot. These are systems that are older and were designed well before the advent of wastewater treatment, and carried stormwater and wastewater in a single pipe. During particularly heavy rain events, they overflow and release untreated wastewater into whatever the nearest receiving water is. We have about a dozen communities in Vermont that still have one or more CSO outfalls. We've been making steady progress over the last 20 years, eliminating them, and this would help accelerate that next phase of the work. There are a handful of communities that are disproportionately responsible for our CSO events, and it's anticipated these resources would be directed there. And those are Rutland, Montpelier, and St. Johnsbury, and Burlington, excuse me, 4 communities. The next tranche of funding is proposed for some dam safety investments. The Agency of Natural Resources actually owns 80 dams, 20 of which have been identified as being in poor structural condition. And this money would be used to do some of the necessary repair and rehabilitation work. We do look for opportunities to remove dams. There are a lot of ones that are no longer in service, but many of the dams we own and operate actually are holding back water to create some of our more treasured recreational assets, lakes and ponds that in fact have many people living around them. The one I've been looking at the most recently, I think, is Lake Amherst in Concord, is a dam that we own and has some fairly significant repair needs. So this would allow us to undertake some of those projects or accelerate some of those projects. The Institutions Committee is probably familiar with the fact that there is a dam safety request included in ANR's capital bill ask most years. So this would be in addition to that and help accelerate that work.
Yes, we had a dam safety engineer. And it was the first time I think he'd ever put 2 and 2 together and realized that dam engineer was something to laugh at. But
yeah, I assume you talked to Ben?
yes.
Yeah, as an engineer myself, I really enjoy my time with him. But yeah, I agree. He
was-
probably hadn't put those together. He takes his job very seriously, as he should.
Yep.
He's got a lot of responsibilities, not the least of which is the operations of the Waterbury Dam.
Oh,
And then the last package is the Healthy Homes Initiative. And this has got sort of three components under it. The first is working with cooperatively owned and nonprofit held mobile home parks to improve drinking water and wastewater systems. Oftentimes ability to pay to make these improvements is a limiting factor. And so being able to provide additional loan forgiveness and grant opportunities specifically targeted to improving this critical infrastructure in mobile home parks is a priority for the agency. In addition to that, there would be grants made available for lower income Vermonters whose on-site wastewater system or drinking water system has failed. Currently, the only tool we have is market rate loans, and that frankly doesn't work for some of our most financially stressed neighbors. And then the final piece of it is partnering with the Department of Housing and Community Development through their housing initiative to incentivize the installation of high efficiency fixtures, as well as ensuring that the plumbing throughout these renovated or to be renovated and rehabilitated buildings is lead free, including the service line. So we've put those together as a Healthy Homes Initiative, but it's really, you can think of it as targeting residential scale water and wastewater systems.
so I'm too late to apply. Darn.
Yes.
Well, I have to say, I've got a state-of-the-art septic system now, but it has to run under a brook and then up a hill in order to stay away from all water sources. And it was quite a project.
Yeah, it probably involves a lot of pumping.
Yes, and 3 manhole covers in the span of about 25 feet in my backyard.
Yeah, I imagine.
I wasn't doing anything with that 26,000 anyway, so it's.
And I'm happy to pause there and take questions. And then I was just going to flag, there is a continued commitment to investing in outdoor recreation that's part of the larger the economic recovery package that ACCD is advancing.
Anybody have any questions or comments? I don't see anybody chomping at the bit.
All right. And so then just briefly at the end, the economic development allocation that ACCD is sort of running point on, there's $25 million dedicated to the outdoor recreation economy. This would be in addition to, there's $5 million of general fund that's part of H315 that would go immediately into VORREC grants, the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. And this 25 million over the next 3 years would be targeted to amenities along and adjacent to rail trails. So kind of putting all the bells and whistles along the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, among others, continuing this expanded VORREC grant program, as well as making strategic investments in both state lands and private lands and trails and other recreational assets. We had the opportunity through an appropriation of CARES Act money to do several $1 million worth of this work on state lands this past year. And it's been enormously successful in terms of improving access and accessibility to some less mobile Vermonters. And we want to continue that work. We've seen a really significant uptick in the use of state lands throughout the pandemic, and are hopeful to be able to encourage people to continue to get outside once the COVID crisis is behind us. And then also part of that economic development allocation is $3 million to support expedited permitting. This would allow for the hiring of additional limited service staff at ANR, the NRB, which administers Act 250, and the Division of Fire Safety, to manage what we're anticipating will be an increased permitting load associated with all of the projects I've described, primarily the water infrastructure projects, in addition to the housing initiative in particular.
It's nice to see what happens when your governor spends a weekend in Danville and rides his bike along the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail for a while. Suddenly money appears. Questions, committee? I don't see any hands. You've done an excellent job as usual.
Well, thank you.
Emily, I know you're here. You've been sitting patiently. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, just here for moral support. And
I don't know if I've asked you this question before, but are you related to Jack Byrne?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, maybe there are a lot of Burns in the world.
Well, I went to law school with a guy named Jack Byrne. I was curious.
Nice. I'm of the upstate New York between Syracuse and Albany Byrne clan. So there's a different one in Syracuse. I'm sure there's one in Albany.
You were not here earlier for our discussion about side judges and why we have 3 judges on the bench, were you?
No.
Well, that's a good thing because it has to do with New York and you probably wouldn't like it.
It's okay. I don't live there anymore.
I appreciate you guys coming on a Friday afternoon that's gorgeous, and we're sure we're going to have you back to talk about particulars as this comes to fruition. And the overview this far in advance is very helpful. So thank you both very much for coming.
Absolutely a
And-
pleasure. And yeah, please let us know if there's additional detail we can provide, and happy to come back and talk further with the committee.
Great. Denise, that does it for our presentation. If you take us off of YouTube, please. Say goodbye